the preponderance of jobs in science and technology are bachelor's, certificate, master's. And we've got to have the PhDs and the masters to drive the innovation. But the real numbers in jobs, and good jobs, are down the line. And they're imminently achievable careers. They're just not viewed that way often because science is sort of viewed as that bench chemist, lab coat, old guy type of paradigm that's off-putting.
A quick interruption to remind you to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast so we can get your feedback and know how to make it better. Hey, it's Ari. Welcome to another episode of the Made in America podcast. And today's going to be a really special episode for me. I have Matt Fleury, President and CEO of the Connecticut Science Center, a longtime friend, somebody I've been pleasure to know for just so many years, done so many great things. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Ari. It's great to be here, and it's great to watch the podcast. It's been a lot of fun and informative.
Dude, I really appreciate that. Matt, I got a lot to ask you, but it's the Made in America podcast. So we start off with the same two questions. What do you make and why do you make it?
We make experiences at the Connecticut Science Center, and we make experiences because it's important that we continue to inspire our society to appreciate, love, and engage in science, technology, engineering, and math. I think, the last year alone shows us how critical science is to our society, to our livelihood, and really to our liveness.
Yep.
Only because of science can we even debate whether you should have to have a vaccine or whether a mask is helpful. Yep. Thank God, while we have a long road ahead of us, science has given us the opportunity to get past a horrible, deadly pandemic that affects everything from our individual personal health and our families and our friends to what we do at work or whether we have work and how we do that.
Yeah, that's really so true. And, I think the Science Center, I'm going to try and turn it to a little bit of manufacturing and how it connects. And certainly want to talk about the Science Center and what you guys are up to. I know we've got a gala coming up, which I'm excited to kind of talk about a little bit. But I've been a big supporter, as you know, of the Science Center. In full disclosure to the audience, you and I knew each other before which was originally the Connecticut Center for Science and Exploration, kind of even got off the ground. And it's been so rewarding to watch because I remember as a kid going to the Boston Science Center because we didn't have a science center here and just being so wowed and inspired by that science and that technology. And I was so excited to have the opportunity to be a supporter of and work with you at the Science Center and just go in there and see other kids and now my own kids sort of be inspired. What inspired you to go and kind of take on this project? I mean, when you took it on, it was 8 people in a small office and an open plot of ground, hoping to one day have a center there. What inspired you to try and take on this challenge?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to you, Ari, you really were there on the ground floor when the way that transpired, and I was inspired. As you know, I came back to Connecticut in 2000 to work for an agency that the state of Connecticut had established to drive a series of Renaissance projects in Hartford. One of those was at the time referred to as Adrian's Landing, a complex that would include a convention center, residences, some retail outlets, and the riverfront park system, and an attraction. And literally in 2000, that's how a parking lot that is now occupied by the Connecticut Science Center was identified in the planning maps, such as they were, visioning sketches and attraction, quote unquote. And I remember being in the office of that organization when some consultants who had been engaged to explore the question of what would be the best magnetic, culturally relevant, appropriate occupant of that site, what that should be. And they dropped down a report on a conference room table in our office on Capitol Avenue at the time and said, you should build a science center. That's what the community wants. And we looked at each other saying, now, how would we go about this? But, the fact is that others before that team had been talking about creating a a world-class science center here in Connecticut for years. And it takes lightning in a bottle to create an institution such as this. In the moment of the state's investments in downtown Hartford, the way the economic picture was at the time and the willingness and capacity of corporations and foundations to help. And what even then was the call to action among employers about inspiring the science, technology, engineering, and math, including manufacturing workforce of the future, was loud and clear, even back in the early 2000s. So we pulled together a group of those leaders to partner with the state to create the Science Center. And when we set up in 2003 a small office that would bring that vision to fruition, you were the guy who made the phones work and made the computers turn on. And it was in that tiny little 3-person IT system that the genesis of this really was born, Ari. And that's really special for me and I hope for you.
Yeah.
And from there, we hired a president and CEO to drive the project, Dr. Ted Sergi, who had recently retired as state education commissioner. And I'd known Dr. Sergi for years, a great educator, great man, a great leader. And he gave me the opportunity to move over to focus on the Science Center project as part of the larger effort in Hartford, which I eagerly leapt to, thinking we could build a really cool thing here, not imagining that I could end up running it for a dozen years. Over the years, I really began to be very inspired by the mission of the Science Center in terms of its importance to the culture of our society and our community here in Connecticut, which, I know the Made in America podcast, you talk about this all the time. And you, I think, with the podcast, express this in a really important way. Our culture, our willingness to see ourselves as an innovating, technology-driven community here is essential to our competitiveness as a state, whether you're talking Greater Hartford or the state of Connecticut or New England for that matter. And that's really what I think really drew me. And one thing led to another. I had the opportunity to succeed Ted as the leader of the Science Center when we opened in 2009. And here we are 12 years after
12
that.
years later, yeah. I think something that not everyone knows, and you alluded to it, but I think it's an opportunity to talk about it, because I think it helps connect how much the private sector was behind this effort, is who was on the board of the Science Center then and now, if anyone goes to the Science Center, and if you haven't been there, you should go. It's really an amazing place. And as I alluded to earlier, it's awesome to see kids' eyes light up and just get interested in stuff in the simplest of ways. It's a water table, but watching the balls move around and how water spins and all that. It's super fascinating. But there's a glass wall, the very base, with names all over it of people who've supported the Science Center from the beginning. So I just wonder if maybe you could talk about the private sector support, who was on the board in the beginning, who's on the board now, and how we can tell that the private sector did believe that and does believe that we needed this inspiration.
Yeah, right. And it's, I think what you see today at the Connecticut Science Center is very much true to the original inspiration and vision of the founders. The founding board members included the chairman or CEOs, or in some cases both, of Pfizer, Hank McKinnell, who was our first board chairman, pharmaceuticals company. George David, who then was the chairman and CEO of United Technologies, a manufacturing company. There were executives of the insurance companies. Pitney Bowes, technology company here in Connecticut. And you go on with the list, Barnes Group, manufacturing company that's now in other endeavors as well. And I do remember, very distinctly one conversation about the idea where the governor, John Rowland at the time, was essentially inviting this group to join in the development of this institution. And, there was, in one respect, the idea of creating a destination attraction in Hartford that people would come to because they wouldn't be coming to the Whalers games or the Patriots games. That was a part of what was happening in the psyche and the reality of our community at the time. And, that was a part of it, but as it began to evolve, it became more of a focus on what's the mission. If it's going to be a nonprofit museum type of venue, what's the real mission of it, to your point, that would actually attract other parties to participate in it and invest in it. And I remember a moment where the governor had presented kind of broadly the idea and its role as a magnet within a revitalization zone, essentially, but had also talked about the vision that it would be a science, education, technology promotion kind of organization. And one of the leaders of the corporate community at the time said, "Governor, if you're asking me to get my company involved in a tourist destination in Hartford, we're a New York company. It's not really our thing. But if what you're saying is that we're going to create something that's going to actually inspire our community, our children, to see themselves in the technology and science endeavors of the future, that's really important to me, because of all the things I worry about competitively, talent is at the top of the list." This is 2004. I mean, and it's accentuated threefold today.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the governor, and this is one of those great moments, he turned and said, "That's exactly what I'm talking about." And I always say, in some ways, that's the moment the Science Center partnership was solidified. And that ultimately became a matter of shifting the ownership, really, of the Science Center idea to a nonprofit organization that's now a separate corporation. It has been since we built it. And the Science Center really operates now with 95% of the funding to run it is derived from revenues from our services, tickets, programs, plastic dinosaurs in the gift shop, you name it. And grants from our generous donors, and about 5% comes from the state supporting it on an ongoing but much smaller basis.
Yeah, and so when you think about that, I think it's just an important point, right? That the key for the Science Center, and one of the things you've talked about from before the shovels were even in the ground, I know Ted was really passionate about it, and the whole team, was about inspiring the next generation. And it's hard to think of it now because it's hard to remember 2004, 2005. Some of the listeners maybe were barely even alive at that time. But it was like a totally different time where it felt like we were moving away from science and technology in a big way. I mean, this is pre-iPhone. I mean, it was like kind of the internet was happening, but it wasn't what it was today. I mean, it was certainly pre-Google, and it wasn't as sexy as it is. And there was this big feeling of a movement away in the United States from technology and engineering in particular, and math. And Connecticut was such a steeped history with the invention of the helicopter, the jet engine. I mean, and so many other things, the gas pump, the typewriter. I mean, so many things we've done, the bicycle, motor car. I mean, we could just go on and on. That there was a feeling of what was happening. So when you think about trying to bring that back, and you look back over the last dozen years since we've opened, how do you think about the success that we've been able to have to inspire the next generation?
Well, Ari, I think my first breath is always, well, boy, we still have a lot of work to do. But in reflecting back on it, it's important and helpful to do that from time to time, because it can remind you that you can actually get things done if you keep at it. I mean, we've probably 3 million people have had a close experience with science and technology at the Science Center since we opened, maybe more than that by this point. It's just a tremendous response from the community that loves the experience. But the experience is really, in some ways, just a mechanism for a message. It's a vehicle to get people to engage with science and feel like, oh, that didn't hurt. That wasn't painful. This is not the chemistry I wept over in 8th grade. And even if I didn't weep over it, I can now see how it's relevant in the real world application. And we've focused increasingly not only on promoting science as a meaningful, relevant, accessible field, but also on promoting the fact that there are real excellent careers in science, which goes to the question of how can we assure that we have the workforce, the talent to drive the kind of industries that have built Connecticut and are going to determine Connecticut's future. And certainly, we're beyond the days when all talent was homegrown, but we're not beyond the days where more talent needs to be homegrown. And the thing that I think drives me very much about this is that we have employers wanting for talent, and we have people who are wanting for opportunities because they haven't seen fit to explore endeavors in the sciences in particular that either seem daunting, off-putting, not for them, impenetrable. And we have to break that down.
Does the Science Center do that? I mean, I think it does, but maybe you talk to the audience about that. Like, how do you think that it can make something that maybe seems unattainable or unreachable more real?
Yeah. Well, you described, the water play area. So this is for the youngest members of our audience. We're not saying, okay, little guy, you're studying physics now. But it's the door opener to asking questions about why that vortex, that funnel is happening. And it's an example of the kind of experiences and activities that we offer, and then our science staff or our exhibits, as you grow a little bit older, start to bring you into experiments that at a basic level cause you to ask questions. Why? I mean, kids are innately pretty good at that. Mm-hmm. We need to encourage that, promote it, and then give them something when they ask. Not, I don't know, your grandfather did that 40 years ago. It's not relevant. So that's a big part of it. I think an example that might be relevant also, Ari, is that we, in our STEM Careers Initiative at the Science Center, we are in exhibits. We have examples and signage, for example, of individuals who are in a science career that's relevant to the science principle of that exhibit. So if it's about, for example, paleontology, it's a dinosaur exhibit. So there are people who are paleontologists. There are people who are involved in different aspects of, excavation and study and archaeology, et cetera. But then there are other, like our engineering lab. We talk about everything from structural engineering to software engineering, and bring it close to home through an experience that's interactive and hands-on, and then a little bit deeper that might be something on a sign that a parent would read, and then start to explain, okay, so this is what this is really about, and how you might want to examine that. And then when we make a deliberate choice, when we bring in third-party experts, an IT expert, for example, to come and talk to our guests to say, hey, I'm a real person who does IT, and you could too. To not have it be the CEO necessarily or the PhD, which for a lot of people really is, maybe not the road they want to invest in, or it's not practically attainable. The preponderance of jobs in science and technology are bachelor's, certificate, master's. And we've got to have the PhDs and the masters to drive the innovation. But the real numbers in jobs, and good jobs, are down the line. And they're imminently achievable careers. They're just not viewed that way often because science is sort of viewed as that bench chemist, lab coat, old guy type of paradigm that's off-putting.
And what to kind of complete that thought, and what we're saying here is by bringing it down to the reality where you can sort of come and have fun and see it at the same time. Speaking for myself, makes it feel so much more attainable, right? Like it's easy enough to come and see a dinosaur. And then, my daughter loves, for example, the freeze frame dancing thing, like in the motion lab, right? There's this like, I don't know what you call it, but maybe the circle, and you put a timer and you can jump and it will sort of take a picture of you and in whatever freeze frame you are at 360 degrees. And so, they're always in there. And then it's always a matter of question of saying, well, how does that work? How can I make that happen? Right. And you become part of it, and it just feels like it breaks down some of the barriers, and it helps you to ask the question why, and there down that path leads like a possible career or an introduction to science and technology. So it's not something somebody else does. It's something I can do too.
Right. Yeah. And, we're not saying that you're going to come to the Science Center as an 11-year-old and walk out with the Pythagorean theorem in your head, because informal learning doesn't happen that immediately. And I guess, maybe this is just a point I should make to amplify this on a broader scale. There's a lot of research that starts with a really basic premise that you spend 5 to 10% of your existence in a classroom. And yet you're learning every single moment that you're alive. You're learning something. Not all good,
right? Yeah.
But hopefully more than not.
Yeah.
And the value that we place on that so-called non-classroom or informal learning time is either small or great. And in the Science Center field, we look at informal learning, informal education as essential. And I think you could say this for, 4-H club, going fishing with your dad, cooking,
Right.
et cetera. But we're very deliberate about that, creating educational moments and experiences that become part of a child's life. And not everyone's going to say, I remember going to the Science Center and that inspired me to become an astronaut. But even if it causes them to have a slightly more openness to science around them, whether it's to help them make better informed decisions as citizens, or actually to be in the practices of science and technology in their lives, it often is inspired by these informal experiences that are the specialty and the domain of science centers.
Yeah, I look at, I always think that we like to do things we enjoy. And one of the challenges I've always found with math and stuff like that is it isn't, and very, like you mentioned cooking is a great example where you could be home with your mom or your dad and you're cooking and you're enjoying it. You have fun doing it. You're playing music in the kitchen. You serve the meal. Other people eat it. They compliment you on it. There's this great positive feedback loop and you get inspired by that. But the math and the science historically and typically is only in school. And, speaking for myself, sometimes that isn't always a great experience. And so having an opportunity to go do something that's fun and connects you back to science and engineering and math and seeing the application of it, whether you're on the 6th floor looking at, the landing on the moon, or you're in like the river, the river exhibit, or you're at the dinosaurs, or you're watching your kid kind of amaze at the funnel or the thing where you build the Legos to try and stop the water, which eventually is, it's like stopping the tide, right? Eventually the Legos are going to get pushed by the water, and sort of seeing them learn and understand. It's fun, and I think that's so inspiring and so helpful when you think about connecting that back to manufacturing. Like one of the things I hear on this podcast all the time is that what people love about manufacturing is building something with their hands. It's taking a raw bar of metal or polymer stock from plastics and turning it into something that somebody uses. And I think that's hard to get in a classroom, but it's so powerful to get at the Science Center. And I think that's so great. And, maybe I'll talk a little bit about, it isn't just the exhibits, right? You didn't really talk, or you haven't talked about the camps or the schools or the outreach where the Science Center goes to schools. Maybe you could talk about that. I don't know that the public knows a ton about that.
Yeah. So at the Science Center, visitors come as families or groups with friends, et cetera, or they come in groups, i.e. a school field trip or a camp group. And then we also go out. So the Science Center provides services to basically enrich the experience of being at a Parks and Rec center or camp, going to community centers, going to classrooms all across the state. A big part of what we do. And those tend to be slightly more intensive interactions with our staff who specialize not only in a science area or several, but in making that exciting through activities and, demonstrations and interactions that they've created and perfected over time. So that's a big part of what we do. With regard to schools, a lot of that is key to the state science framework so that it's a really appropriate and valuable use of time in a classroom, not just kind of helter-skelter And the field trips are designed the same way so that a teacher knows there's a trail guide, for example. There's specific exhibits that are tuned to the state science framework. So the thing they're teaching, if they choose to, they can point their students to specifically at the Science Center.
So reinforcing.
Yeah.
I mean, so maybe you get the application of what you've been reading about in the books or behind your desk. Now you can see how it works in the real world.
Right. Yeah. Observably, bring it to life, et cetera. There's a study about this that I thought was so fascinating. I think it was in Maryland. They had two groups of students, I think middle school students. One was an urban setting of poor students, and the other was a suburban setting of students who were in better economic conditions. Both groups had performed very well in school that year. And at the end of the school year, were essentially parallel. So the question was, how would they look when they came back in the fall? And over the summer period, the students without the enrichment opportunities, the informal learning opportunities of the wealthier students, relatively speaking, fell off a cliff in their academic achievement. And it just, I thought, was such a powerful example of the importance of learning time being used valuably in and out of school, and the really deeply challenging situation we have where the societal infrastructure to provide that is sorely lacking in parts of our community. And when we're talking about equity and inequity, this is obviously a huge issue. And credit where it's due, in the state of Connecticut's pandemic recovery plan using the federal money, they've invested a lot in this whole summer enrichment initiative. The Science Center is one of the providers to try to create opportunities across, the various, facets of our community, whether it's in the city or in rural Connecticut, to make sure that, particularly at a time when isolation by virtue of the pandemic and virtual, et cetera, has been really serious, that every child can re-engage in some way socially, with content, with experiences, with learning, and keep that mind active in a constructive way. I think we're going to see that the pandemic does really bad things to learning and to engagement, probably even more specifically. But this is, and I think it's out of recognition for that the state education department, the health department, Governor Lamont have all said, we've got to go after this. And we have funding from the federal government to do this. Let's point it in this direction. So it's exciting to see a recognition that we have to have enrichment experiences over and above what we provide in the formal education environment.
Yeah, I like how you connected some of the challenges that, some of our more urban communities and some of our more rural communities, because there's a lot of parallels there in terms of accessibility to enrichment opportunities. So it's great. And I want to take two opportunities here. One is, the Connecticut Science Center is in Hartford, but it's really a state organization. Maybe you could just speak to, what the Science Center does outside of just in the building and how widespread that is. I mean, you had mentioned it goes out, but just talk a little bit to that, because I think it's an important thing people should know.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have zip code data on members and attendees, so we have a pretty good idea where people are coming from. And
Speaking of using technology.
Right. The database is really important in our world. So we know that we have attendance from across the state, and pretty strongly up into western Massachusetts. The Springfield area really loves coming down the highway to the Science Center. And then, to your point, we go out as well. And we'll have, whether it's a one-off going to Stratford to do a program for a day with a YMCA, or whether it's a really deep engagement as we have with schools or districts in Waterbury, New London, you name it, will be in those communities working with their schools and their teachers on a continual basis. In some cases, we're helping their teachers tune up their science communication skills so they can be more effective in the classroom.
Which is hugely important. Another thing that I think people don't know, right, that the Science Center doesn't just do stuff with kids and their parents, but also works with teachers to help them be more effective. And it's sort of the, literally train the trainer to help kind of spread that. And so when we think about building the workforce in Connecticut and inspiring kids in technology, it's also inspiring their teachers to get renewed love of science, and that's going to come through in everything they do.
That's right. Our Mandel Academy for Teachers is a teacher professional development program, and that's exactly the reason for it. And one of the things educators love about it is, we don't tell them what they already know about teaching. We tell them, the special techniques one can use to engage, mostly with science. But many of these are applicable across subjects. And we've, again, keyed a lot of that to the state science framework lately. How do you communicate this principle? Mm-hmm. How do you get that across to your kids? So that's an important way for us. We're big, but we're small relative to the number of schools and students and teachers in the state of Connecticut. So there's a lot of leverage. There's a lot of exponential impact of taking a teacher's proficiency to the next level, because that teacher will reach dozens of kids or hundreds of kids over the course of a year, over the course of a career.
Right.
That's pretty exciting.
That is very exciting. Yeah. And you touched on this, and I know that people are feeling the pandemic. Well, who knows where we are now with Delta, but sort of coming and going a little bit. We've talked to a lot of different businesses and organizations that have had different impact, but understanding how a science center works, that not only do you have people come in, but you go out to schools, a lot of which has been closed, and a lot of the stuff you do at the science center being hands-on, and the way it was designed to be, super engaging, was anti-pandemic in a lot of ways. I got to imagine it was a tough year for you guys.
Yeah, very challenging. And, we, being who we are and surrounded by the kinds of people we are, we had some really good resources to turn to advise us on the safest way to operate. So on one hand, yes, as a hands-on institution serving both grandparents, the most vulnerable in the early stages of the pandemic, and little kids
who can't be vaccinated.
Right, who couldn't be vaccinated or are hands-on, because we're definitively a hands-on organization. It was really challenging. That said, as soon as the governor said that we could open under conditions that were quite prescriptive, we determined how to do it. That meant some adjustments in what we did and how we do it, and some of those adjustments persist today. I mean, for example, we got to a place with the vaccination rate and the infection rate that we were able to drop our mask policy for vaccinated individuals. Then come, Delta variant, and advice from the public health experts that masks should be required again of all individuals in public venues or a public venue with the mix of kids and grandparents, et cetera. So we did the right thing and went back and re-implemented the mask policy. So those kinds of adjustments, are not convenient, they're not popular, they're challenging. But that's what we've been doing. And, the reality is, through the 2020 period of the pandemic, we were there really on mission. We felt if ever there was a time to say, love science, science will find the way, science is our road out of this, it was 2020. So we made a decision after making some really hard choices, like a lot of businesses did, about staffing and the size of our organization, to survive the thing, that we were going to be open to the public, but do it responsibly. And the fact is that not a great many people came. We probably served more people online because we pivoted to a lot of services to be delivered virtually last year by necessity. But they still came. Those who came really appreciated it, and they were safe, and we had no incidents. But beginning of 2021, people started coming back. And now with the free summer at the museum program that the governor, with the pandemic funds and the legislature, decided to support, we've had a tremendous response, really tremendous response. And people are loving the opportunity to be together again. And I like to think that they are still coming to the Science Center, and by and large, without compliant with our mask requirements. They feel like, we're learning that there is a safe way to be together and have experiences again. And we all hope and pray that that's not our long-term future. But we figured out how we could do it now. And, it's a way to keep people engaged.
It sure is. Yeah. Actually, I'd forgotten you should mention that about the free summer. For people that don't know what that is, you should explain it.
Yeah, and free summer will end September 5th or 6th. But basically, the state allocated a considerable amount of money to say to museums, if someone comes in with a Connecticut ID, that child will be able to be admitted for free, and essentially their ticket is charged to the fund, to the Rescue Act fund, and an accompanying adult can do the same. And we've had a tremendous response to that. But I do think it's interesting that even before that offer, we were seeing not a heroic rebound in attendance, but people were, eager to get out and felt like this was a good place to do it. But it's going to be very interesting. I know, as a business leader, you're asking these same questions. Once the, Rescue Act funding goes away, we get back to kind of the run-of-the-mill business conditions. Will they be the same? And will they support the models that we've established? We've made a bet for years that we could derive a certain number in revenue year to year that gets adjusted, and that would support a level of expenses. Clearly, that's changed now. So we have to, have our eyes open going forward and set ourselves up to make the right decisions to not shrink away from growing the things that are really important to serve our community, but be very deliberate about, making those choices carefully, because if you make the wrong one, you get too far over your shoes, you're in real hot water and you can't do anything.
Yeah, it's a fact. But listen, I will say this. There is no doubt that the need, and you talked about this right from the beginning, the need for more people in science and technology and engineering and math, that's real. And I mean, the pandemic or no pandemic, people have said to me over the years so many times, oh, but how's business? And I say, well, I'll tell you what, I've yet to go somewhere and they said, hey, can you get rid of these computers and bring the typewriter back? It's just not happening. So, I think that, every year more new technologies come out. And to link this all the way back to the manufacturing, when I think about what's happening in 3D printing, when I think what's happening in advancement in materials and material uses, the tight tolerances from tenths to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, the automation, the lights out machining, all the industry 4.0, the wireless, and all that stuff. And then you add to that, which is a little bit outside of manufacturing to some degree, but Pfizer and all the other biomedical companies all over the state and what they're doing, and the need for better health. That none of that is going away. And the Science Center plays a pivotal role in all that and helping to inspire the next generation of homegrown talent. So, it merits supporting. I'm continue to be a big supporter and rooting you guys on. And on that note, before we wrap, because we are getting to the end of time here, I do want to just talk about, and in full disclosure, my wife is on the committee, but the Science Center has an annual gala. So maybe talk about the annual gala for the Science Center and what it's all about and when it's coming up and how people might be able to support it.
Yes, and thank you, Ari. It's been really good of you and the company to support the Science Center, and certainly the biggest contribution you make is through the presence of Erica on the gala committee. She's such a treasure and a great person. About half the funding to run the Science Center is donated by individuals and generous corporate sponsors and foundations, and government support. So one of the things we do, which many organizations do, is to raise money. We have an annual fundraising event. We call it the Science Center Gala, and we're having this year's gala in person again. It appears that we're always ready to make an adjustment as needed. That's going to be October 2nd. And we've actually had very, very good support from sponsors and early ticket sales, but there's still tickets available. If you go to the Connecticut Science Center website, you can find them. We hope people will come and have a great time. And the theme this year is really going to be Thank You Science. Last year it was Love Science, and we still love science. Look, we're in scary waters right now with Delta and Lambda and who knows what's next. But we are definitely in a position to prevail over this horrible virus. We have a lot to be grateful for. Science and technology have gotten us here. And the people who do it, deserve our appreciation. It's just an incredible, heroic year, I think, for everybody who's had some role. And they're not all the people you expect. It's not just about the vaccine. Somebody makes masks. Somebody makes barriers. Somebody, somebody does the data. I mean, the data analysis that has informed our pandemic response is extraordinarily powerful and important. I could go on.
No, and you're right in my wheelhouse because you're right. I mean, I think about it all the time. To create this vaccine, it took researchers, it took microscopes, it took centrifuges, it took all that data, compiling the data, it took, regression analysis, and I'm getting to the limits of the science that I know. It took somebody making the syringes and the needles and the coolers and the chillers to transport this stuff. I mean, it took so much behind all this, and it wasn't something, the reason we were able to have the response that we had. I mean, we're used to the Prime generation, right? We want to order the vaccine on Amazon as soon as we find it. It should be here in 2 days or less. Clearly, it feels like from that perspective, it feels like it took a long time. But if you think about how humanity had to deal with pandemics, which essentially was just let people die off effectively, in centuries before, it's amazing what we've been able to do in such a short period of time, and science is to thank for that. So I think Thank You Science is a great theme. So ctsciencecenter.org is the website. The Science Center Gala is always a really fun time. The themes are really well followed. People dress up funny, and I don't know if you're doing it again, but Matt often does a presentation that's memorable and usually out of character. Well, I guess now in character because we've come to expect it. But whether it was the Saturday Night Fever dancing or whatever, Matt, you never you don't disappoint. Star Wars, whatever it's been, it hasn't been a disappointment. So on behalf of as we're coming to the end. Oh, actually, I want to do rapid fire round of questions. I got to get to that. All right, are you ready?
Probably not.
Probably not. All right, here we go. Rapid fire. Red Sox or Yankees?
Red Sox.
Thank you. Starbucks or Dunkin'?
Wow. Not much of a coffee drinker, but I'm going to go with my wife's preference, which would be Dunkin'.
Dunkin'. When you travel, no pandemic, staycation or take time off? Staycation or exotic destination?
Oh, staycation.
iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Sports car or SUV?
2004 Volvo station wagon.
Neither. Do we have a favorite business book?
Business book.
Or book in general, if that's
easier. Wow. Okay. There is a very interesting book that I'm working through called The Alchemy of Us by Ainissa Ramirez, who is a Yale professor and a wonderful author on science, and really brings a lot of our greatest inventions and science challenges home in a very approachable, smart, enjoyable way. The Alchemy of Us.
Alchemy of Us. Check that out. Matt, if you had to do something other than be the president, CEO of the Connecticut Science Center, and it could be anything, what would you do?
Well, that's not too hard for me to answer, actually. I'm a part-time musician. I love music very much, have my own bluegrass band. And if there was a business model that would support that habit, I'd pursue it. There's no risk of that right now.
No risk of that right now. Matt, what's something that you learned early in your life or early in your career that you think's helped propel you to all the success that you've had?
I think the biggest sort of experience that I can, remember and that's relevant to that is that you really can't anticipate what's around the corner. And it's important to try to build prospectively the skills that you'll need for whatever is around the corner. But in my case, for example, I couldn't have anticipated that I would be running a science center, so I didn't study museums as a kid. Or science very much, truth be told. But I think it's about learning to be curious, learning and continually honing the capacity and the skill to learn, to ask questions, to study, to learn, to just discover things and adapt. I mean, this is just such a fast-changing society and world and business scene that adaptability is key. And I think that people who are hiring now are looking for that, are looking for problem-solving, creativity, innovation. Those kind of core soft skills are really important. And then, leveraging those into the part willingness and part good fortune. But the willingness is being willing to make a change and accept an opportunity that may not have been on your radar. And then the luck part is, did you get it right?
Yeah.
And the only other thing I should say, and I know you only asked for one, but mentors, I've just been extremely fortunate in life to have a few individuals come through my world who believed in me and were willing to give me opportunities. And if it wasn't for them, I'd be the first to admit I probably would not be where I am.
Yeah, well, that goes all to being luck, but right, I always think luck is when skill meets opportunity. So, last question. What's something that you learned later in life, later in your career, that if you went back and told young Matt, and he'd listened to you, that you think would have helped him tremendously?
Being CEO is not the same thing as being in charge. I think all of us grew up with a paradigm of what the boss is about. The boss has unmitigated power and authority to dictate things, and people willingly do those things, and if they're not willing, they do them anyway. And there is a form of leadership that works that way, but I don't believe it's particularly effective. I guess I have grown to appreciate through my own experience, to be perfectly candid with you, that the way to lead is really to cultivate trust and cultivate investment among those you are there to lead, or to put it a better way, to support as a leader. If they're invested in ideas because they've had a role in the genesis of those ideas, or at least the ways to implement them, people are much more likely to be invested in realizing the success of the organization.
That's great, Matt. I'm 100% going to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everything you do to inspire science and the next generation of technologists in our society.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by IT Direct, a CompassMSP company.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in and spending some time with me today. My goal is to help build a community where we can learn and grow together. Your input, feedback, and engagement is critical to making that happen. Please do comment, like, and subscribe so more and more people can hear what we're doing and join our community of growth and success. Thanks so much for tuning in. Talk to you again soon.